You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
You're listening to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Paul Bestall. We delve into the world of Sasquatch today, as I am delighted to welcome the one and only Dr. Jeff Meldrum to the show. Dr. Meldrum discusses some of the cases he's investigated over the years, which includes the Paul Freeman case and some of the casts he'd received from Paul. We also cover some of the claims attached by witnesses to their Sasquatch encounters that seem to have been proven in modern investigations with great apes and monkeys. But before that, of course, don't forget you can support Mysteries and Monsters by signing up at patreon.com/Mysteries and Monsters. $4 a month gets you ad-free episodes, guaranteed early releases, bonus content, and more. You can also click the link in the show notes. Thank you to Dave and Daniel, my latest patrons, and thank you to each and every one of you that continue to support me and the show through your contributions. Thank you. Mysteries and Monsters is across all social media platforms. Please subscribe to the Mysteries and Monsters channel on YouTube. You can also visit mysteriesandmonsters.com for news and episodes. The Mysteries and Monsters merchandise store is exclusively available through TeePublic. You can click the link in the show notes. Our intro and outro music are provided by the marvellous Weary Pines. Thank you as always to Dean Bestall for his wonderful artwork. The show is produced by Brennan Storr of the Ghost Story Guys, and Mysteries and Monsters is delighted to be a part of the Straight Up Strange network. And so, without further delay, let's welcome Dr. Jeff Meldrum to Mysteries and Monsters. My guest this week is probably the most well-known scientific defender into the possibility of an unknown species of primate or hominid walking amongst us. A professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University, Dr. Jeff Meldrum is the go-to resource for anyone wishing to get the lowdown on all things in the scientific realm regarding Sasquatch. Dr. Meldrum, I am delighted to finally welcome you to Mysteries and Monsters, sir.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, for the invitation. Much appreciated.
No, the feeling is mutual. Thank you so much. I mean, where to begin, really? You are one of those gentlemen that has been fighting the scientific corner since you were sort of pulled across, it would seem, Dr. Meldrum, into the possibilities and the ramifications of the possibilities of such creatures living here, because as a young man you grew up in Washington, I believe, out near Spokane, I think it was. Mm-hmm. So you've kind of been in Bigfoot Central for most of your life, and so was it surprising that 30 years later that childhood excitement of the Patterson-Gimlin film sort of finally reeled you in?
Well, not so surprising that the childhood excitement was still there, but that the opportunity literally opened up and reached out and pulled me in. I mean, this youthful interest had certainly become rather latent over the years as other things vied for attention, and quite honestly, as public interest and as evidence didn't seem to be advancing, at least certainly not from the perspective of most lay people, and certainly not the scientific community, with the rare exception like Dr. Grover Krantz and a few others that sort of dipped their toe in the pool, so to speak. But I never really, I mean, certainly there was some influence in the ultimate direction that my research went, but I honestly did not undertake a career in the evolution of bipedalism, studying the evolution of bipedalism, in order to position myself to be ready to study Sasquatch, the question of Sasquatch. I mean, certainly there was some synergism, but that ended up just being a very fortuitous development out of the whole thing. So, I mean, and quite honestly, when I was the interest in the possibility always sort of re-sparked occasionally, little flashes of interest and curiosity, some that were charged by current events, Some, honestly, by simply pulling that box off the closet shelf and opening it up and looking at some of the clippings and some of the books, all of which were stored away. They weren't occupying, space on my bookshelf, quite honestly, at that stage. And so when I first really got pulled in to look at this, it was out of curiosity, but with a real suspicion, a palpable suspicion that this was all just something that's been perpetuated. And now, from my very informed position, it would be a very straightforward procedure to simply point out the zipper, so to speak.
Yes.
And that was really how I approached it. And then, a few things happened that gave me pause and caused me to reconsider that position a little more objectively. And then one thing led to another, and it just began to snowball. And I realized that there was this body of evidence, which now I could appreciate even more, was more impactful from a point of view of someone very versed in the subject matter, and having experience, having the frame of reference, having the contextual comparative basis for interpreting some of this footprint evidence. It was that which drew me in most decidedly because of that expertise. So, it wasn't merely a rekindling of that youthful curiosity. I mean, that was an element, but it was so much more than that.
I think as well, it's quite clear, because obviously because of your scientific background and your experience and what you've specialised in over the years, you were a prime candidate, as you say there, to be able to dismiss anything that had come across. And I would suspect that, was it something that you were challenged or shocked by when you realised that with all your experience and the work that you'd done prior to that in your scientific discipline, that you couldn't see the zipper and you couldn't think, well, that's a man in a suit?
Right. And I don't often tell this part of the story. Usually we kind of begin with because of the role the footprints have played in my career in this arena. We don't often talk about what preceded, what prompted me to go up there and pay that visit to Grover Krantz. And it was the infamous Redwoods video, which was shot down in the Jedediah Smith Redwoods by a film crew shooting a TV and entertainment series called Out There. And, it was the circumstances were such that it seemed like the most unlikely of situations to draw in a serious academic, one that was decidedly more skeptical, at least in leaning that direction. And so when I was asked by Richard Greenwell to help evaluate this piece of video footage that was allegedly shot down there on the Smith River in Northern California, it brought back, there was a certain nostalgia, but I thought, this will be a great exercise now to apply my understanding of my experience in comparative primate anatomy and locomotion and biomechanics and so forth, and just, like we've said, point out the proverbial zipper. And in spite of the fact that it was a very low quality piece of video footage, there was enough to go on to really pique my curiosity, and I was, quite taken aback. And one of the things that really struck me again, interest in the foot, was the way it stepped. And, for most people, it's not obvious at all. But I just had this sense of the motion of that foot and its flexibility, suggesting this mid-tarsal break, even at that early first encounter of late. And that, drew me in to look more seriously at everything else. And, it was stunning. One of the exercises, and I posted this recently because someone had come across the Jay Leno interview with Anna Marie Goddard,
yes,
where she describes her her experience. And, he's kind of merciless in mockery of her. And she takes it, in stride very well, to her credit. But as a result of that, people started asking more questions again, because there's a whole generation that has never seen that piece of footage, probably. And it caused me to reflect. And so I went back and I grabbed a couple of images from my archives. But one of the things that really struck me is you could frame grab a still from that video and then find a frame from the Patterson-Gimlin film in which the film subject was in a comparable posture, and line those two up side by side, and disregarding the difference in scale, because we established with a good deal of confidence that whatever was in that Redwoods video, it was well over 7 feet and closer to 8. So there was probably a half a foot, 6 inches to 12 inches difference in size. But yet the outlines, the shape and the proportion, the head profile and the shoulders and just the thickness of the torso and the limbs was so remarkably similar. You could not look at those two things and at least acknowledge that if one or the other or both were hoaxed, they had clearly received inspiration. And obviously, given the time difference, it would have had to been if the Redwoods video was hoaxed, it was imitating the Patterson-Gimlin film in overall appearance, and yet not taking advantage and instead of using the best available film stock under bright daylight conditions at fairly close proximity. It was dark and rainy and low light conditions, and using a handheld, off the shelf video camera with very high noise to information to data ratio to this. And so, but you're absolutely right. I mean, I entered into that exercise thinking, this will be just a fun distraction, a simple kind of, a project or experiment to test my ability to point out all the inconsistencies and all the anatomical shortcomings of a cheap costume.
Yes.
And instead there were, questions about the foot. There were questions about the genitalia. There were questions about the overall size and shape and circumstance. So it was interesting, to say the least.
I suppose from that point on, you kind of really began to build a reputation, Dr. Meldrum, of getting sort of your hands dirty and getting out there, because as far as I'm aware, the next kind of character in this whole crazy world of Sasquatch research from North America is obviously you became acquainted with the Paul Freeman cases and some of the castings that he had. And I know Paul seems to have gone through a bit of a sort of a re-evaluation over the last 5 or 6 years. I know his son's been very vocal and supportive in regards to representing his father's work, because having seen some of Paul's interviews from the sort of early to mid-90s and ongoing, he seemed to be a deeply passionate man who clearly had some kind of life-changing experience to him. But I think, as with anything in this particular field, he seemed to be a character that a lot of people focused on to try and scupper, as it were, much to their shame, I think, which always comes along. And there are numerous characters that always pop up and try and insert themselves into all kinds of stories and have revisionist histories about their being responsible for every set of footprints in the world. For you, was that the kind of situation where did it seem too good to be true, or were Paul's first few sets of castings compelling for a man of your experience?
Well, they were. Indeed, they were. And I, in this particular case, there were sort of, how can I put it? Not extenuating circumstances, but there was a build-up. There was a little more backstory, and that was as we were returning from this investigation down there in the Redwoods, where we actually were on the scene and doing the measurements and calculations and reliving this on the air flight home. Richard Greenwell reaches in his briefcase and he hands me Vance Orchard's Bigfoot of the Blue Mountains. And it was Vance Orchard was a columnist in that region, had a outdoor column that frequently returned to the subject of Sasquatch and followed many of the exploits of Paul Freeman. I mean, people think, Paul did spend an inordinate amount of time, and Michael has made that quite clear, that his dad was borderline obsessive on this subject.
Yes.
And every spare minute, and even minutes probably that weren't spared, he was driving on those roads and looking for sign and so forth. And yet, for all that, when you look at the footprints, many of them, there will be multiple prints that he's cast from a single site. So when you space them out along a timeline over a 10-year period, there were some gaps of 2 or 3 years sometimes when nothing happened, nothing was found. And so that's, if you're a hoaxer, that's pretty poor showing of your abilities to, unless you're going to such lengths that you're trying to use some reverse psychology, I guess. But so I had some buildup. I had a contextual framework from which to consider Paul's evidence, and also recognize that he wasn't operating in a vacuum. There were other people in that region involved, either directly or indirectly, and who I also got to know and became very acquainted with. And but it was Paul who took me out and showed me this long line of tracks, which he actually was sort of unimpressed with. He was just, it was the first set of tracks he had found that season in the spring of '96, but he was going, I won't even bother casting these because they're not perfect. I've got so many casts, which we had just been spending time removing from the boxes, laying out and examining in his basement study. And as I've said, for me, what he considered imperfections were actually signs of animation. They were signs of the spontaneity, of the credibility, actually, of this remarkable line of tracks. And so I had that. That served as the springboard. I mean, I was so compelled by what I was observing that then, and not that I wasn't already extremely impressed. I mean, I had spent the whole afternoon up in Dr. Krantz's lab on this little trip that my brother and I, on a lark more than anything, had taken, and discussing the footprint evidence, most of which in Krantz's collection right there, or at least a significant majority, came from the blues, from Wes Summerlin and Paul Freeman, and Bill Lowry and Kevin Lindley and so forth, these people that were active down there. So there was that, and there was the study of this book in preparation for writing a review of it, and now to have, and then looking at the original material in Paul's home for several hours before he volunteered that, well, hey, you know a lot about footprints. How'd you like to see some fresh tracks? And so that was what led to us going up into the foothills and examining the tracks that he had just found that morning, as coincidental as that seemed. And in fact, I was, found it a bit incredulous that the coincidence of it. And yet, what have we got to lose? So there we went. Anyway, so I guess came at the topic from a point of view that had been bolstered and already corroborated by multiple testimonies and evidences and so forth. And I found it just rather mystifying. Well, no, I didn't really. I found it curious. There was no mystery to the motivations at all. Curious at the certainty, the certitude with which some of the skeptics railed against him and denied the credibility of his evidence. I mean, René de Hinden, for example, was very vocal, but there's no mystery. The Freeman footage and his footprint casts vied for attention. They distracted from René's singular interest in this, or financial interest, which was the Patterson-Gimlin film and the associated footprints. And others, it was a little less obvious. Bob Titmus was very, very critical of Paul, and I don't know where exactly that stemmed, because he never provided real substantiation for those objections. Joel Harden, the notorious Border Patrol agent professional man tracker, and I emphasize that he was a man tracker, because all of his interpretation undercutting Paul Freeman's finds were clearly limited by his specialization in man tracking. He found objection in the very things that distinguished the Sasquatch tracks from human tracks, apparently unawares, in ways that are absolutely consistent and logical biomechanically and functionally for a large, heavy bipedal primate versus a human with an arched foot and a stiff-legged striding gait. So I found it almost amusing, if it weren't so distracting. Again, I guess that's a good word to keep repeating, because it distracts away from, or detracts. It wasn't really a direct assault, but a distraction. It pulls attention away from, or misdirects attention away from the evidence. I guess I wrote a response to his report, and I can't remember now off the top of my head where that was published, but I have long intended to write a review of the chapter in his book in which he repeats and perpetuates some of the misconceptions and condemnation of Paul and Paul's evidence. It's curious, because on the other hand, you have more PhDs involved with the analysis of evidence coming out of the Blue Mountains of southeastern Washington and northeastern Oregon. Myself, Grover Krantz, Dr. Henner Fehrenbach, Leroy Fish. There were, Leroy didn't have a PhD, but he was a professional wildlife biologist. There were so many people that drew attention. It was the first area where dermatoglyphics were documented, or at least described and documented. There actually was. I was aware of an incident that occurred in Idaho, a little college club, cryptozoology club, which was mentored by an anthropologist up there. Were going out and investigating reports, and one footprint find, the prints had been cast with an epoxy resin, and the conditions of the substrate plus the casting technique was good enough that it picked up dermatoglyphics that were noted by these college student investigators, but nothing ever came of it. I made mention of it in a footnote, I think, in my book, or in a paragraph in my book, as a footnote to the discussion of the dermatoglyphics, just for completeness, because it was interesting how it independently, in a totally different region, had been noted by some scholars who were observant and were aware of the significance of dermatoglyphics as a defining characteristic of the order Primates, at least the type of dermatoglyphics that we see. There are skin ridges on some other arboreal marsupials, for example. So again, to reprise, but to summarize for your question, I think that you're right, that the criticisms of Paul are undeserved. While acknowledging, and this is an important one, the mindset of a scientist who has gone through rigorous education and training in ways of thinking, ways of questioning, ways of investigating, documenting, and so forth, are different than your typical person. And whereas the means is just as important as the ends in the scientific endeavor to the non-scientist, that may not always be the case. And so, did he ever embellish, or did he ever, gild the lily a little bit? Or, something as simple as one of the criticisms of the dramatoglyphics was, and this is a clear case, I think, of an innocent tainting of the data. And that is, Chilcutt noted that there were multiple core fingerprint patterns evident in some of the toes of one of the casts bearing dramatoglyphics. Therefore, he said Paul was faking it. He was using his fingers to create a footprint. Well, I've seen so many cases of amateurs seeing a footprint, whether of a wolf or a bear or potentially Sasquatch, who just can't resist putting their hands right in the footprint or touching the toe pad, the toe imprints or if someone's getting ready to pour a cast, pulling out sticks and leaves and so forth, Yeah. I always tell people, sure, if it's clear that it has blown in after the fact, then sure, you can very gingerly remove that material and clear the field a little bit. But if it was part of the contact surface, if it's at all impressed into this, don't pull it out. It's part of the footprint. And in so doing, you're going to disturb your contact surface. Well, some can't resist. They pull a root from a toe and the side of the toe collapses. So what do? They pack it back in place with their finger. And if the conditions of the substrate are appropriate, they'll leave a fingerprint right there, which then may transfer to the footprint cast. And I think that's what happened in this case. So other than those types of things, I don't think Paul ever set out. I have examples, by way of illustration here in the collection where, for example, the really interesting set of 3 footprints from the little trackway that actually there's film footage of. Yes. I had been under the false impression that it was directly associated with the video of the creature going, from right to left across the screen, and it's not. They're disassociated by a number of days at least. But nevertheless, we have video of him finding that trackway, and then the subsequent casts. One of them broke right across the midfoot. It just, it was probably too green when we tried to pull it out. Well, it's interesting because he has tried to, in a very poor fashion, actually, but he's tried to repair that by plastering it back together and then backing it with some more plaster. My attitude would be, if I were hoaxing and it was easy for me to, with using my fingers and my hand to crank out one, why would you bother trying to repair a broken cast like that? Why not just chuck it in the waste bin and dustbin and make another one? Yeah. So I think that's kind of interesting. Whether that we can play psychology and second guess all around the mulberry bush, but I think his the criticisms of him and the evidence that has come out, and that's another thing that just came to mind. He's not the only one finding evidence. Yeah. There have been others working in those areas that have had experiences that have found evidence. I suppose
for me, Dr. Meldrum, I certainly wouldn't ever say I'm au fait with cutting edge science and anything in regards to animal biology and the physiology of such things. But when it comes to the faking of casts, or as we've recently had once again, and this is one of the strange things about the world of Sasquatch, is I remember this recent report about black bear sightings being correlated with Sasquatch sightings, and therefore every single person that claims to have seen a Sasquatch has actually seen a black bear because they're all idiots. Right. Which for me just strikes me as really bad science, because essentially what they've done in that report is they've stripped away all the supporting evidence that goes with the sighting and simply compared it to where black bears are. And therefore, if you want to do that, then that's fine. But you can't tell me all those 500 sightings or whatever the number was. There's no data to them. And when we dive into the world of Sasquatch witness reports, it is the uniqueness of the experience that strikes the witness as the fact that they're seeing something highly unusual, something that allegedly in the modern era shouldn't exist. These people are seeing a fantasy, and yet that is what challenges them so much. And so when I saw that report, It really struck me in regards to the nonsense that appeared about 20 years ago when Ray Wallace passed away, and his family came out and said that he was responsible for every set of Bigfoot tracks found in North America, which, when you look at the media's acceptance of that, it's baffling in its stupidity, in my opinion, because I know I read some of the reports that Sanderson and Green were doing in the 60s when people were putting forward hoaxing, and they were saying they were going into areas where people hadn't been for 3-4 weeks and stumbling across a set of tracks and saying, well, why on earth would someone go there to lay some tracks in the snow, not knowing who's going to turn up, how long they're going to be there for, is there going to be fresh snowfall? It would be ludicrous to suspect that a person, or even as the Wallace family claimed to have this gang of nephews traipsing around all the woods in North America, certainly getting the steps in, if nothing else. This modern comparative survey that's been done strikes me as exactly the same kind of thing, that the media have gone, oh, well, that just proves it. And I just think, how can you accept that? I know people criticise the media in general, Dr. Meldrum, for not asking the right questions or not being rigorous enough and just regurgitating things. But even as someone with as limited a knowledge of scientific exploration and evidence, even I can look at that and say, well, that's bad science, because that survey has been completely fixed to give the result it wants, and it did.
Sure. Absolutely. No, I agree with all the points that you've made, and you made them very, very well. We unfortunately are in an era when so much of scientific reporting, even when it makes the scientific category of reporting, because so often it doesn't. So often it lingers in the human interest angle. It's always the closing little wink, wink, nod, nod story of human interest. But even when it is treated by science journalism, the track record is not good. It just isn't, with very few exceptions. And there's always exceptions, of course. But you're absolutely right. When it comes to eyewitness testimony, there are just so many variables. That's why I find the early reports, the pre-internet reports, to be very interesting and intriguing, because there were so many. I mean, if you were a Bigfoot enthusiast, the only way you could get information is if you stumbled upon some group that had a newsletter, or the very few publications that were in the library, often away from the books about animals, down in the esoteric knowledge book, the very low numbers in the Dewey Decimal System, which is an interesting commentary in and of itself. When you talked about the footprints being out in remote areas, and often the timing of which is so serendipitous that it could go either way so easily. There was a rash of now exposed hoaxes, and one of the interesting themes was, in all three, they had taken advantage of the drought conditions which had resulted in drawn down reservoirs, exposing vast mud flats, which made great substrate for laying down tracks in a place where there were lots of recreationists. Out on the mud flats, there were there was one case here in Idaho that it occurred, and it was people out four-wheeling on all-terrain vehicles that crossed the mud flats that saw the footprints, and they had come down from one boat landing and made their way wandering across the mud flats, and then exited on the next boat landing down the shoreline. But it got some attention. So those are good examples where the hoaxer wants the gratification that comes with the discovery and fanfare surrounding the hoaxing. You don't invest the kind of time and effort into just a very iffy proposition of whether anyone's going to be draw attention and make a fuss over it. It's hard. And so this article, which echoes one that of several years earlier, a much more qualified set of individuals, I think, But nevertheless, it's clearly a case of correlation with no effort to justify causation, and actually not even making the case for causation, but allowing the press to do it for you. So it's interesting to look at the headlines, how they read so much more into the results, even if that was the implicit intent of the author. But the author, and there will be some reviews and commentaries of that latest of paper in the Relic Hominoid Inquiry, a journal that I edit. Those commentaries will be forthcoming here shortly. I'm just, now that we're past the end of semester, harried couple of weeks, now I can settle down and focus my attention on wrapping up some writing and editing responsibilities. But if you read, instead of jumping right to the conclusions, read his introductory paragraphs. It betrays a tremendous bias and misrepresentation of fact that is already inherent in that paper. And so, it's I'm not sure where the motivation comes for that kind of an undertaking, especially when it's done in such a slipshod fashion. It seems to be vogue to be skeptical. It's almost like protesting today in the younger generation. It doesn't matter what the cause is. You just want to get out there and participate and have something to rail against with feigned passion. And some in the skeptic quarter, it's an echo chamber, and they feed off of each other's deriding. Now there are, every time you say something, I always try to qualify it. I always try to see both sides of it. There are people whose objectivity and critical thinking is sincere and is well founded. But when that becomes your hobby horse, when all you pound is that one key, whether you have past laurels to ride upon or not, when that becomes your singular focus, then you're doing a disservice. Because more often than not, as we've seen, as history has shown, that the quality of argument becomes so questionable. It becomes so biased, so one-sided, and so skewed. It is just prejudicial. So anyway, I always try to turn it back around. I find that skeptics have their favorite missing piece of data, and they'll harp on that to the exclusion of an acknowledgement of everything else. So somehow our failure to have documented this data point, this type of evidence, or it may just simply be a physical specimen without, like in the words of Michael Shermer, the science starts once you have a body. Well, that's so inane. That is so. Maybe your viewers haven't heard this story, so let me repeat it because it's worth noting. One of my most vocal critics on campus was an instructor in the physics department, and he had an opinion on everything. He was very, very opinionated. He even wrote a column for the local newspaper, and so he pontificated or opined on everything under the sun. And I was a favorite punching bag, straw man, and his department chair was sympathetic to his point of view, apparently. And so it got to the point where at one general faculty meeting, the university president, without naming names, actually called him out and said, enough is enough. It's not appropriate for faculty to be attacking the character of one another, that we should be tolerant of one another's research interests and academic pursuits. And it was very interesting. I wasn't in attendance because of a prior commitment, but I got lots and lots of feedback from other faculty who knew exactly what he was talking about. But at one point, these guys, I think it was in shortly after the column by Michael Shermer appeared in Scientific American. And it was something like, where's the body? Where's the beef? And this was his mantra. Science starts once you have a body. Well, and so this physics instructor repeated that, and another letter to the editor came from the department chair, who chimed in as well. And of course, I was the focus of their criticism. So I wrote back in response. I said, well, this is really interesting coming from a pair of physicists. I said, show me an atom, show me a string, show me a black hole, show me a neutrino. I said, all these phenomenon that you study, you don't have a body. You don't have no corpus delicti. You're simply observing and noting the influence of these bodies on their surrounding, the trace that they leave in their environment. But you have no body. You can't point. and that I pointed out. Isn't it interesting that same description of the type of data that you're pursuing, that you're accumulating, is the same kind of data that I'm engaged with in pursuit of a body. So that kind of shut him up a little bit for a while, but it's there's such a disingenuity. It's as I was pointing out, they're so fixated on so often on one missing piece of data, and then you ask them. Well, here's another example. This one I haven't repeated for a long time, so it'll probably be new to your listeners. I had been invited by a faculty member in the anthro department at the University of Wyoming to speak to his class. It was more towards folklore than it was hard physical science, physical anthropology. But nevertheless, he was broaching the topic, and basically he was trying to get at the relationship between empiricism and the non-empirical experience, the subjective basis of folklore and mythology and so forth. But anyway, he wanted me just to approach the subject as I do as a physical anthropologist. And I also was invited as part of the package to give a public presentation on campus to the campus community and the community at large. And it was very well attended, and the department chair was there. And he asked the expected question, and that is, well, where's the physical evidence? He's a forensic archaeologist, so he wants the physical trace of the existence of this creature, namely its remains. So at dinner, we were sitting across the table, and I gave him the apologist response about the taphonomic principles, which he's quite aware of, and the natural history factors of a species like this that would make population numbers very low and longevity high and deaths a rare event in and of themselves, but then all the physical and biotic factors of decomposers and scavengers and acidic soils and yada yada yada. And drew attention to the comparison to Gigantopithecus blacki, a species that is acknowledged in the fossil record, but for its 1.5 million year tenure in East Asia, we have what? It's now up to 4 jaws. Then it was only 2, but 2 more have been added, and a few thousand isolated teeth, all from karst cave, from limestone caves, where the preservation, and those only because of the taphonomic bias imposed by the action of bone concentrators like porcupines, dragging the bones into the caves. So at dinner, I asked him, I said, well, so what, did you find that answer at all satisfying? And he very bluntly said, no, not at all. And then he went on, he was kind of talking about his background and, that biologics cannot exist without leaving a physical trace kind of attitude. And I said, well, and then I pointed out this observation that those of a more skeptical mind tend to focus on one thing, but ignore all the other evidence. And his response was, what other evidence? and I got blunt then, and I says, well, you were attending my presentation. You were oblivious to all the other evidence. I said, let's take the footprints. His response was, oh, I'm not an expert in footprints. So I fired back, well, I am. Don't you think I deserve the same deference I would give you if the subject of conversation were forensic archaeology? Well, then he changed his tune a little bit, and he was a little more open-minded. But it's so funny.
Yeah.
I mean, just that simple acknowledgement that, hey, there are other people who are absolutely as smart as you, if not smarter, and they have, would they be doing this? Would I be doing this? Would I open myself up unnecessarily to all this criticism, all this, this attention, which some people say, any attention is good attention. That's not exactly true, a truism per se, but if I weren't motivated by a sincere conviction about the legitimacy, about the credibility of the evidence that indicates such a creature very probably exists. And it's funny. It's just it's been an interesting, it's a whole different side. It's not, well, it is. I was going to say it's not central, and it isn't central to the question at hand, but it has such influence. This the frame of mind, the attitude, the prevailing notions, the paradigms can so influence the way in which people perceive the evidence. And that's what Kuhn pointed out, a paradigm shift, that these specialists are looking at evidence, the very same evidence, but looking at it now in a different way. One of the only illustrations in his book is that picture of the rabbit and seagull, where if you look at it one direction, it's a seagull. If you perceive it another direction, it's a rabbit with long ears pressed together. And he points out that this is a great metaphor, because you can look at that same image, but it can mean two different things. And your perception can change when it's pointed out to you that there's an alternative way to view this. And we've seen that, with the advantage of years now accumulated and 2020 hindsight, you can see the evolution of the perception of the question of Sasquatch and other relic hominoids against the backdrop of prevailing notions of conventional wisdom, of paradigms, prevailing paradigms. And back in the 60s and 70s, when Ivan Sanderson presented his book, published his book, fantastic book, 1962, the prevailing paradigm was the single species hypothesis. That's what was coalescing, was the notion that the hominin niche was so exclusive, so particular, there could be only one species in it. So human evolution was seen as this single file march of species supplanting species over time. And so, since we occupy that niche today, there is no room on this planet today and for the past 300,000 years. There is no room on this planet for other bipedal hominin or hominoid species. And so when he suggests there's not one, but multiple across the globe, there's no hook to put, or hooks to put those entities on. And so they have to be fabulous. They have to be mythical and folkloric. And that was the reception he got. It fell, kerplop, did a faceplant. Now we see evolution not as the single file march, but as this radiating, ever more complex through time, bushy tree, and wax and wane in complexity through extinction and so forth. But there are multiple ways to be a hominin. There are multiple parallel side branches. There are lots of hooks for notion of a Sasquatch-like creature with a circumpacific distribution, of a relic Neanderthaloid, of a relic Australopithecine in Southeast Asia, or maybe even South Africa. This recent book that was published by Patterson is fascinating story from an area that few people had any familiarity with, and yet the traditions of this diminutive hair-covered critter was bipedal critter is well entrenched there, and so on and so on. It's just that alone. That conversation alone should keep the door open, or throw the door open on the conversation, because to me that is just so fascinating how over time we've come so much about this phenomenon has actually anticipated by decades. what we now understand as conventional wisdom. But the shadow, unfortunately, casts is long and overshadows the change in attitudes. But so they're slow in taking root. It'll be a whole, as Kuhn himself said, it'll require the turnover of an entire generation before the attitude shifts notably.
I mean, I find it quite surprising, because we only have to look at, as you've referred to there, Dr. Meldrum, the changes of perception in regards to human evolution from 40 years ago to what we know now.
Right.
Probably the two best examples are the discovery of the Denisovans, who are essentially a species that was undiscovered until 40 years ago, randomly found in a cave, I believe, the first remnants of them. And now we realise that, here's another member of the lineage. And then you only have to look at the whole Homo floresiensis situation, which kind of deals with things on numerous levels, because you have cultures all around the world that had stories of small hairy creatures, from Scandinavia to the Philippines to South America to some of the Native American tribes and First Nations people, obviously in North America as well, Dr. Meldrum. These are stories all over the place, and they were always dismissed as folklore, and yet 20 years ago, we find an island and a cave full of tiny bones that shows that there was a real population of this. And yet, once again, as you were saying there, the theory used to be, I always like to compare it with vegetables. So people used to consider our evolution as like a stick of celery, and it was straight up. And you might get a leafy bit at the top, which is probably when we all started mating together about 50,000 years ago, from when people started looking at this. Now it's more like a big head of broccoli. You've got branches all over the place and intertwining and intermingling, and we now know that Neanderthals weren't exterminated. We mated with them, and we've cross-pollinated and absorbed each other and essentially become to that, because obviously we now know that some people have Neanderthal DNA. We know that there are certain personality traits and physical characteristics that are obviously genetic mutations from down this lineage that still reoccur, which is why you can sometimes get some people who have a history of no red hair in their family, apart from their sort of great-great-grandfather, and then all of a sudden they have a child and it's got red hair. Obviously, in the old days, people would go, really? Is that, it's the kind of, has the milkman been more than delivering his bottles, Dr. Meldrum? And so when you have these incredible earth-shattering discoveries, it shocks me still that it seems to take so long for it to come into the public conscious these days, because it's quite clear that there's so much going on in our past. And I once had a conversation with Micah Hanks about this, and I said, do you think it's because when we look at the history and evolution of primates and hominids, it gets nowhere near the attention as, say, in comparison, dinosaurs and reptiles and birds and their evolution? Because most people, when we talk about Sasquatch, will talk about Gigantopithecus, but they know next to nothing about the other large hominids that were all over the place. And therefore, then you would suggest, well, why, once again, as we were talking about small, hairy creatures being seen all around the world, you have cultures all over the world that have large, hairy creatures. So they can't all be pinching each other's stories, because most of these people would have never met. Right.
Well, and that has kind of served as the seed for the notion that this whole thing is just a manifestation of the human psyche, that the wild man is an archetype of our longing for that continued connection with the wilderness, our alter ego, the Enkidu Gilgamesh sort of story. They were fast friends, but in some ways, and I don't know if anyone's ever interpreted it like this, but they sort of epitomize the alter egos of the uncivilized versus the civilized man. Anyway, and so that makes it, you have to at least acknowledge the possibility that some of these things are folkloric, that they are stories that have been elaborated, embellished. I mean, when you look at fables and fairy tales and even Native American stories, often things of the natural world are imbued with spiritual qualities or with even supernatural characteristics. It doesn't negate the reality of the basis for that story. And there are some what we think are extremely fanciful creatures. And, in some instances, those as well may have basis in reality, have been so distorted through the retelling. A colleague of mine, I had shown a slide of a medieval bestiary that had some very fanciful depictions of some animals which we now recognize. You would be hard pressed to actually call what's depicted there a crocodile, but there it is, and it has the characteristics: a giraffe, and there's a unicorn. And I said, so some of these have been relegated to the realms of mythology. He came up to me afterward and he said, well, which ones are you talking about? I said, oh, well, like the unicorn. He said, go back and read the original description of the unicorn. It had a single horn in the middle of its nose, not on the top of its head. It wasn't shaped like a goat or a horse cross. It was bulky, had thick skin. It was a rhinoceros. It was the first encounters with rhinoceros, but ended up being, at least in his opinion, ended up being the basis of the unicorn. So honestly, teasing out those is a bit of a challenge. One better suited, I guess, or there are those better suited to do that than I am. There's no question that the things that seem to be empirically based also have representation in more fanciful traditions. We would expect that to be the case and the rule rather than the exception. So like I said, don't feel qualified to, I was going to point out, that was it. A very good read along these lines has just been published by Gregory Forth. He published a headier, more academic book entitled Images of the Wild Man. But because it was published by an academic press and it's a little less accessible, it's also very expensive. So he published a book for a more popular audience. It's called Between Humans and Apes, as a subtitle. But it looks at this question of Homo floresiensis, which he had been studying the stories of the Ibu Gogo and Baha'i on the island of Flores as a graduate student half a decade earlier than the discovery, had made note of these stories of these diminutive, hairy, humanoid creatures, but yet also pointed out the fact that he was struck, since he was familiar with the whole panorama of folkloric entities, that this was described differently. This was talked about in the same way they talked about, the animals the hunters brought in that were butchered by the local meat cutter and whatever. And he referred to them as empirical entities. And so that actually anticipated the discovery of Homo floresiensis by years. It was really quite uncanny how that all came out. But in this book, he goes through and shows the remarkable parallels in so many aspects of the described anatomy and behaviors of these creatures that correlate with those that can be inferred from the fossil remains and archaeological remains, associated remains of Homo floresiensis. I would have thought, and it had an impact, brief though it was. Even Henry Gee, the managing editor of Nature, made the comment that in response to the discovery of Homo floresiensis, that maybe it's time for cryptozoology to come in out of the cold. Maybe there's also kernels or grains of truth to the Sasquatch and Yeti stories. Something actually a biological, as I've said in which should be the subtitle, I guess, of my book. Is there a biological species behind the legend of Sasquatch? That's what it boils down to. Is it just mythology or folklore or legendary? Or is there really something that forms the basis of those legends?
Well, it's quite striking that over the last sort of 10 years or so, I've seen people look at the Scandinavian legends of trolls.
Yeah.
Primarily probably on the back of the discovery of Homo floresiensis and beginning to look at them in a more empirical way, as you refer to there, because I think a lot of people, when you mention a troll, most people say, they live under a bridge or they can only come out at night, and if they get caught in the daylight, they'll turn to stone. And obviously the Scandinavians, you can't walk in a shop in Norway, which I've been to several times, without stumbling across a troll of some description, whether it's an animatronic one or a plastic one you can have your picture taken with. They're very proud of their trolls in Scandinavia, Dr. Meldrum. But I think as we've learnt more, I think as you say there, it kind of points to there must be kernels of truth with these stories, because some of them are very strange in their behaviours and things. And I think, once again, when we look at some of the reports in regards to Sasquatch and other hairy hominids from around the world, there are some parallels with what we see in the Great Apes and Monkeys that perhaps the person who has a sighting isn't going to be very up to date with, isn't going to know, because I find it very hard to believe, and I don't mean this disrespectfully to the average person wandering around in the woods, that we often get these stories of people being hit with an overpowering scent or a smell, and yet we know that certain great apes, I think gorillas are probably one of the best candidates for this, that when they're under stress or they're feeling aggressive or they're looking protective, they release a sort of musky smell to kind of sort of give credence to the fact that they're ready. If trouble comes, they're going to be ready for you, and that smell is your warning to either come and make you stand, or you can just go away. Thank you very much.
Very, very, very true. And we have the remnants of that as well. There are two kinds of sweat glands: the apocrine glands and the eccrine glands. The eccrine produce the watery sweat. So when you're at the gym or at the beach and the sweat's rolling off your brow, that's intent for evaporative cooling. The other produces a more sebaceous and oily secretion, which doesn't evaporate so easily, but is also much more scent laden and rapidly, under the action of bacteria, becomes quite odoriferous over time. And as you point out, gorillas have very few of the watery sweat-producing glands, which is why they're not well adapted to endurance activities, strenuous activities, because they overheat. But they have much more developed apocrine glands across their chest, in their axilla, down in their crotch area, the perineum, and so forth. And you're right, they can produce. Just as if, say, you're going in for that important interview or standing up in front of an audience, you sweat differently. Yes. You sweat in very particular places, and it has a tendency to be more odoriferous, which is why we have certain places we put deodorant on us. Those are the areas that have concentrations around our faces even, which are much more prone, under the influence of hormones, puberty hormones, to become out of balance and produce acne and so forth. There are so many things about that. Again, this notion of anticipation. There are stories of, for example, of Sasquatch abducting children and cannibalism. The retort is, well, where does that come from? There have been documented now cases, and more recently especially, well, not that recently, but start to lose track of time at this point. But in any case, of great apes, chimpanzees in particular, abducting, where they're greater. The chimps are more aggressive in that respect. But it's under conditions of drought, and this is not only eating their own or their neighbor's child of their own species, but abducting human children, human toddlers or infants. And there was quite a rash of this occurring in Uganda during a particular drought. And I got some firsthand information from an individual who was in the wildlife service over there, that they were dealing with some of the consequences of this. So suddenly the Native American stories of children being snatched by these giant cannibals are not necessarily just so stories. They could, in fact, have been spawned from a particular incident that then became central to a theme, and whether it happened on a frequent or regular basis. I mean, in Uganda, when this hit its peak, and the press finally became aware of it, there were 12 instances in a 7-month period. I mean, that's not rare at all. That was an epidemic of snatching, and people were being very, very, cautioned to be very cognizant of where their children were and where these chimps were, especially when they're out in the fields. So, things like that. Central to stories about Bigfoot are eating fish, but great apes don't eat fish, right? Well, if you checked every book on my shelf behind me here, not a single reference to that behavior, eating fish. And then all of a sudden, on a TV documentary, there were these orangutans eating fish that had been stranded when there was a flood. Fish had been stranded in these pools, and they came down and ate the fish. I was talking to an acquaintance of mine, Esteban Sarmiento, who I just had a chance to rub shoulders with again in Ohio recently. But when discussing this very fact with him, he says, oh, yeah, he said, the bonobos eat fish all the time. They'll just get into the shallows and they'll herd these little fingerlings into the shallows, and then just flick them up onto the beach and then go and pick them and eat them like sardines. And I said, why isn't this reported anywhere in literature? He just kind of shrugged. Well, no one's been particularly motivated. It was just such a taken for granted. But I said, there's not a single piece, not an article I could find online, not a book on my shelf where mention of fish eating is documented. And yet, so here again, Sasquatch seems to anticipate these behaviors. Dr. Bindernagel's first book, and to a lesser degree his second, but his first one in particular, that was sort of the theme of the title, North America's Great Ape. And he tried to he made the case that the anatomies and behaviors, as I've reprised it and rephrased it, the anatomies and behaviors of Sasquatch can readily be accommodated by those of the known great apes. And also with the caveat, you got to also always bear in mind, we're dealing with, chimps, bonobos, gorillas, and orangs, which are themselves just remnants of a once much greater diversity of apes that existed during the Miocene and through the Pliocene, and a few surviving into the Pleistocene. Gigantopithecus, that's why it sometimes has the title, the fifth great ape, because it survived well into the mid-Pleistocene, if not late, depending on some dates that you see bandied about out there, if not to the present, if that turns out to be demonstrated to be the candidate ancestor for Sasquatch. That remains to be seen, or to be determined, one or the other. But my point being that what we have today is simply the tip of the iceberg of diversity of anatomies and behaviors that were expressed in this diverse radiation of tailless great apes. And so when comparing Sasquatch, I think it's a great exercise to draw analogy to the anatomies and behaviors of the great apes, but recognize that if there is something that seems inconsistent, that seems anomalous, it may very well find correlation in other extinct members of that radiation, which had members that inhabited a diverse spectrum of habitats, locomotor adaptations, dietary specializations, etc.
Well, I mean, as we had this conversation last week, the news came out that they'd found that orangutans were using plants as medicine, which was one of those things that people have suspected for a while. And as you were referring to there about apes not eating fish, I mean, that famous picture of that orangutan that's created a harpoon leaning over the river. Right. Spearfishing. Right. We've realised that chimps have started to use tools, and I don't think it's that they've just started to do this. I think we sometimes perceive that we know everything about the world around us, Dr. Meldrum, and I think, especially when it comes to animals, with the greatest of respect, we've been filming them for 60, 70 years. Prior to that, we had random people who would go and study them for periods of time, but it wasn't usually the people that lived there. They would be people from Europe or North America or other such places, whereas the locals were probably ignored or their sort of first-hand knowledge was dismissed as perhaps tall tales. And now it seems every sort of few months we get even more clarity and clarification on the intelligence of apes and monkeys from around the world that 10, 15 years ago would have been inconceivable to some people.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Our understanding of the natural history and behaviors has grown tremendously. And I think, as you point out, people have begun to realize that contrary to sort of the Victorian notion of the gulf between humanity and nature, that we are not, well, and even then the idea was suggested, we are a part of nature, not apart from nature. And the differences we observe are differences of degree, rarely differences of kind. I mean, sure, there are some benchmark thresholds that have been surmounted by the human species, but there's so much similarity. I mean, that's why we find such interest and even entertainment in our own reflection seen through a glass darkly, so to speak, or like a distorted reflection in a circus mirror. But we see so much of our behavior. And as you point out, I mean, even with the medicine, I mean, how many of us have seen, our dog when suffering from a bit of indigestion, or a cat? I've seen cats do this as well, go out and chew on the grass, and then shortly thereafter regurgitate everything that was giving them a sour stomach. I think that the behaviors, certainly there's not the thought process going on about, and even humans, I would maybe give humans too much credit, because it's just give me the pill that's going to make me feel better. We have no understanding of the mechanism by which that occurs, or why it happens. But the animals have learned remarkable behaviors. It's a survival strategy. I mean, those that have successfully innovated and passed that on, either culturally or genetically, have been successful. So there's strong selection pressure for those kinds of things over time in certain lineages, I guess, where the basic raw materials are in place. But it's fascinating. This kind of touches on too another thing which I often get a lot of flack for. People love to label either you're a and it's paranormal sometimes, or or normal, or it's more human-like or more ape-like, and without again recognizing that it's not an either-or. There's a continuum, and there's quite a bit of space between our understanding of early hominin evolution and Homo sapiens. But I use this slide in some of my presentations where I've managed to find stills of the great apes, a couple of great apes, have a gorilla and an orang and Sasquatch and Homo sapiens, all in a patty. And I say patty, Sasquatch patty is a frame from the Patterson-Gimlin film, and have them all in just about the same pose. And so their limbs are in the same posture. And then we play the Sesame Street game. And I ask, which of these things is not like the other, And when you take into account the most striking difference in the Sasquatch, these other two apes are capable of adopting that posture, walking on two legs, but their limbs and their pelvis are decidedly distinct and different. And in that regard, the Sasquatch, with its longer limbs, shorter pelvis, rounded buttock, bears more striking resemblance to humans, but in every other respect, including the lack of the swimming trunks, which is representative of the lack of material culture, they represent, or they're consistent with a great ape. And so Bindernagel's title, North America's Great Ape, is reinforced in a remarkable way. I try to point out to people, I don't consider my humanity to reside in the position of my big toe, whether it's divergent or non-divergent. And we see a diversity in anatomies of big toes amongst the living great apes, and certainly distinction in the early bipedal hominins, which were essentially bipedal apes with brains barely 10% bigger than a chimpanzee, if even that. I mean, Homo floresiensis, I always great at that designation of Homo because it is so political. It's so baseless. The argument for tool use and fire control is a tenuous one at best. But this creature has a brain that's actually smaller than a chimpanzee's because they're smaller in overall body size, actually. But it's a relic Australopithecine, almost certainly. It has nothing to do with Homo erectus or any Homo. But that's the point I was trying to make there is the false dichotomy. And that when people say, that was it. When people say, they're not just apes. Well, that just is a very pejorative adjective there. People that's used by people who have never had any study of or close firsthand experience with great apes, probably not even with other animals. People who don't have pets. Because that's the point I wanted to make, is we're beginning to realize, for centuries, Western culture looked at animals as just kind of automatons. They're just mechanical things that go through the motions, but they have, at least we gave them no credit for thoughtful reflection or cognition or emotional responses. But if you've had animals, dogs or cats, or even I had a toad that was so responsive. Well, people could argue, well, an amoeba will react to light and dark. They're reactive.
Yeah.
But this toad he would recognize when you came in the room, and he wouldn't react the same to all people when they came in the room. So, to have an animal of that grade, an amphibian, have such a personality is really shows how we have underestimated the capability and the potential. So that elevates. When you talk about Sasquatch that has the brain at least as big as that of a chimp or gorilla relative to body mass, that should elevate the esteem with which you hold such a species, without having to go to any artificial lengths to equate their behaviors to indications of humanness. Stick to the facts, ma'am. Just the facts.
Well, absolutely. And I think if anything, it just shows us that often the perception is also that when it comes to certain scientific disciplines, they are inflexible. They are bonds that cannot be broken. And yet, as we're speaking here, and we're talking about some of the things that have been discovered in recent years, Dr. Meldrum, it's changing people's perception. Science isn't like that. It's probably one of the most flexible things in the world because knowledge changes the concepts. And that applies to all the scientific disciplines, does it not?
It does. It does. Obviously, some are more. Well, I have to be careful here. There often is this distinction between hard and soft sciences disciplines, but even when it comes to things like physics, was just watching a little blurb about relativity and the whole area of quantum physics, which unfortunately has been misapplied, I think, to this topic in some ways. But the point being is that even what we consider to be hard science, we are just kind of scratching the surface still. And you would think history would teach us. That's the thing. and I try to catch myself if I become or perceive that I am becoming sort of set in my ways or in my thinking patterns. If we reflect back on history, how tentative so much of what we took for granted really was and continues to be. And yet I guess it's sort of a self-preservation reflex that we try to reassure ourselves that we have have confidence in our current reality, I guess. And that certainly can influence the way we perceive. I mean, I don't mean to presume to be a psychologist, but just from my own personal experience, we come to accept our notion of things. And, that's one of the biggest challenges for a scientist, is to be detached from your own hypothesis. And you're supposed to be trying to falsify the hypothesis, not primarily looking for substantiation. I mean, in practice, we emphasize the things that bolster our notions, our interpretations, whether that gives us comfort or whether that gives us is an ego boost. There's many different elements involved, I'm sure, with each individual. So there's not one size fits all, but it does. It really stymies me sometimes to see the resistance, the still persistent resistance to the notion that such a creature exists. And the justification takes the form so often of just inane argument or total ignorance. And by that I mean it in both ways. The more polite way, that's just a lack of understanding, a lack of knowledge, but also an attitude of neglect, of disregard for a subject matter, because it doesn't. When I'm told it can't exist, therefore it doesn't exist, and even then the added admonition, and therefore it doesn't matter what evidence you think you have. That came from a colleague, a fellow anthropologist, in response to a paper that had been written. And I just, was stymied by that attitude. It can't. But see, and this kind of coming back full circle in a way on this one point, at least, for the longest time, that just stymied me. It blew me away. Where does that come from? How can anybody, any intelligent, thoughtful person, labor under such a debilitating ignorance? Well, then when, again, I emphasize this to my students all the time, you always have to consider a subject against the backdrop of history. Everything is relative to the prevailing notions of the time. Whether you're going to see the rabbit or the duck or the bird, whatever. And at that time, we talked about the single species hypothesis. So when they say it can't exist, where did that come from? Yeah. Not that, such a creature couldn't be right under our nose. It actually probably has its roots in a much more profound way, and to their credit, in a way, namely the single species hypothesis. There can be only one hominin niche, one occupant of that niche. Therefore, these other things you're suggesting can't exist. According to our paradigm, there can be only one, and we are it, one bipedal hominin. And so that's where it comes. So they can't exist, therefore they don't. There's no theoretical context. So I'm not going to be troubled by the suggestion that there are. And, therefore, all your evidence, so when these scientists in 1967, still laboring under the single species hypothesis notion, look at this creature walk across the silver screen, as impactful as that must have been, the reaction would have been very akin to this. Well, it can't exist. So this must be a hoax.
Yeah.
So how do we rationalize our conclusion that it's a hoax? Because they're not going to understand that it can't exist. So it has hair on its breasts. It walks like a man instead of a female, male instead of a female. It looks like a hybrid. From the waist up, it looks like an ape. From the waist down, it looks like a human. That can't exist in nature. And all these really silly objections were raised, which should have been red flags at the time, but it was easy. It's just like you said, how the media is so quick to jump on a a silly explanation like the Wallaces being responsible for all these footprints. All these tracks have been made by carved wooden stompers.
Yeah.
That the Wallace clan has tromped around in. It's a simple explanation to dismiss a very complicated, but in today's world of sound bites, 2-minute sound bites, you can't. That's my biggest handicap is I don't know what a short answer is. I mean, I do, but it's not an answer. It's just a short statement. But how do you answer something unless you go on and on and on? I mean, unless you understand the context and the historical background and the philosophical underpinnings and all the potential variations of interpretation.
Yeah.
There is no such thing as a short answer. So that's intriguing. The whole thing is a fascinating topic.
Yeah. Well, I think the last thing I want to touch on before I let you go, because I could sit here for 10 hours and speak with you.
Sure.
I'm sure we've both got better things to do with our time than speak to each other. So.
Well, other things, not better things. But
It's very kind of you. Obviously, your big project this year is you are doing a sequel to your fabulous book. This is coming out working in conjunction with legendary producer Doug Hychek, obviously responsible for Monster Quest, which you appear on several episodes, Dr Meldrum. Was this a natural thing to do for you both in regards to following up? Because, as I mentioned earlier, it's a wonderful book. You are a very well-respected member of the Sasquatch community across the entire world, really, Dr Meldrum. And therefore, when someone like yourself announces that they're doing a new book to such a wonderful tome that you released several years ago, was this built on everything that's come since then? Because we have had some great strides when we look at some of the newer characters that have got involved in this and the work that's going on in places like the Olympic Peninsula with the guys up there. Obviously, you've got the certain secret locations that people are doing some real groundbreaking work in there. You've got some newer members, people like Amy Boo and Shelley Covington Montana, who are using a lot of tracking and nature knowledge to bring to this, because often a lot of people, with the greatest respect, who go out there on the hunt for Sasquatch don't come at it with a lot of knowledge in regards to flora and fauna and other things around there, and they may miss things that may indicate a better and more substantial case on top of everything else that we've had so far. So for you guys, did it seem like a natural thing to do a sequel?
Oh, yes, I think so. And I'll have to go back to the broadcast of this and take notes. That was a great list of things to include in the. That was great. Well, and it shows how much has happened in the past. What has been a couple decades, but 2006. So what is that? 17 years. Yeah. 18 years. Yes. I mean, at one point I had wanted to do a revision, a second edition, to try to expand upon so many of the lines of evidence that in which great strides had been made. And as you point out, there are so many interesting elements. So obviously this is, and then I got sidetracked. Because there was some resistance from the publisher about revised editions and so forth and so forth. And then I thought, well, I want to do the, what in my mind was this, not the sequel in terms of a revised edition, but to expand the scope. Because so often I get the question, well, what about, for example, the Yeti or the Homo floresiensis? How do those relate to Sasquatch? And I actually wrote my second field guide is a guide to relic hominoids of the world. It is a shrunken head, an abstract of what the intent was, and I was well down the road on that. I mean, it's just on the back burner right now, about half done, simmering, and my lab has one whole bench covered with banker's boxes filled with my documentation and collected files for that book alone. But then Doug came along with this notion of doing Sasquatch Lizard Science 2. And as you point out, it's a natural outgrowth of one. There have been lots of not only new personalities, but new technologies, new techniques that have potential for the execution of field investigations. And so, while it won't be just a revised edition of my first book, it will be a new book, but it will, I think, in many ways will have a similar organization. There will certainly be references to and continuation of the themes established in those individual chapters, each of which focused on particular types of evidence. We may have to add a chapter or two, but try to bring it up to speed. And especially as it comes to methodology, I think with the advent of more in-depth, for example, acoustic analysis, with the rapidly improving methods of environmental DNA, with drone technologies, and combining that with thermal imaging, with greater penetrance, greater ability to see past the tree canopy. Those things are going to be what take the investigation to the next level. Not just boots on the ground and camera traps and not that I employed some of those techniques, wood knockers and parabolic dishes and so forth. I mean, all those things have their place. Those kinds of data are still useful. I don't want to discourage anyone from collecting that kind of data. I mean, even things like now having an iPhone Pro with LiDAR and software photogrammetric apps. I just posted one on my Facebook page that the folks down in Florida had captured a footprint, and I posted it. And I mean, they certainly weren't the first, and they won't be the last, but there was some good discussion about the application and the practice needed and so forth, that I thought it would be a good stimulus for discussion of that technology. But the days of plaster may be numbered, thankfully, as we have. But that's going to raise all kinds of additional questions. I mean, certainly in this digital age and in AI, and especially with a audience that is perhaps more susceptible to things, less discriminating in some sources of information, which seems to be examples of repeatedly online. But anyway, so I had a major setback, as you might be aware.
Yes.
Lost about 4 months when I would have been working on this project. And even now, this past semester, still wasn't really up to speed, although I've been continuing to collate and organize, written several chapters. And it's fascinating, too, how the inexorable forward march of knowledge bears on many of these things. So, for example, I was working feverishly on the vocalizations chapter. And in my review of the literature, it's now been demonstrated, as I had predicted, that gorillas do, in fact, produce infrasound.
Yeah.
And it does involve the inflation of their air sacs. There was a CT study, a fantastic CT study of the orangutan, exploring the extent of these these extra laryngeal air sacs, which are most developed in that Asian ape lineage. And that raises some interesting questions. We don't know the derivation of Sasquatch. If it is from Gigantopithecus, then it would have close affinities to the Asian radiation of apes. If it's a more recent hominin, then it probably has greater affinities to the African apes, which by all appearances, that seems to be more the case. The very distinctive facial features of an orangutan. But then again, so you got to be careful. Every time I do this, I have to always check myself. Yeah. Is we have one representative, two species, but two closely related sibling species separated on islands that represent the Asian apes, and we have bonobos, chimps, and gorillas, of which we can slice and dice a little bit, that represent the African apes. So just as define the human population, its diversity of appearance, facial structure, by just plucking someone up from Tonga and someone from Korea and comparing their facial features and saying, oh, well, that's the range of variation we see in Homo sapiens. We have to be careful. But nevertheless, I mean, when it comes back to the vocalizations, I think there's a pretty strong inferential case to be made by analogy that Sasquatch will eventually be demonstrated to have significant extralaryngeal air sacs that support its habit of very raucous, loud calls that it uses to space itself as a population and or attract potential mates as appropriate, timing-wise. So anyway, my point, again, my point was in writing that chapter, and I'm sure this will be the case with each and every chapter, a lot has happened in the past 18 years, and advances have been made in knowledge. It'll be interesting to see how some of the hypotheses or some of the propositions laid out in some of the other chapters as we get into the review of the contemporary literature and opinions of other experts, and hope to garner or to recruit the participation, by interview or whatever, whether in the documentary or not, of other experts, just as we did, as Highcheck did in the first production. Expand upon these themes and make the case even stronger.
I mean, that's an interesting point you bring up about the air sacs in orangutans, because obviously for a lot of people who investigate and delve into the history of hominids, obviously the closest one to the orangutan is the orang pendek out there in Sumatra, which is described as being a very similar colorization. Obviously spends more time on the ground than perhaps the orangutan relative. I know some people have postulated they think it may be a species or whatever similar that we've lost track of, and it's only, as you say, once again, locals consider it part of the natural fauna. As far as they're concerned, it's a real creature. It's not a mystic legend or anything like that. But off the top of my head, I can't think of any reports of that particular creature being involved in incidents of infrasound, as we do get with say, Yowies and Sasquatch reports. So that would be interesting. The next time I speak to my friend who's gone looking for the orang pendek several times, Dr. Meldrum, I'm going to ask him about that, because that's something we've never really touched on. So that's an interesting aspect of it, because, like you say, if that's something that we can see in Asian members of the ape family and also the African members of the ape family, then surely you would suggest, if we are looking at similar lineages, that would apply to hairy hominids on different continents as well. As we were saying earlier, is this one of those situations where perhaps all of them have this ability? The Yeti, the Yeren, the Almasti, the Yowie. And because we in the West don't have access to as much information about these particular creatures and the investigations into them based on where they are geographically,
right,
are we missing a trick across the world because we don't have that body of evidence to support some of the reports we've got in westernized cultures such as North America and Australia?
That's possible. I mean, it's obviously always hard to, if you're, well, and not if, as it's difficult in light of the fact that we are limited by the ability of observers to note details of what they're observing, especially if they're unschooled in what the possibilities even are. But here, let me throw a little twist back at you, because the premise is based on an assumption that may not be well founded. You made the connection. I mean, there in what we have right now, much more development in the orangutan of these extralaryngeal air sacs, seen to a lesser degree in gorillas, and much less developed in chimps. In humans, only occasionally showing up as an atavistic trait, just small outpouchings from the larynx. Now, if the orang pendek is a relic Australopithecine, then it has its closest allies amongst the chimpanzees.
Ah, of course, yeah.
Rather the orangutan.
Yeah.
So right there might be the simplest explanation. The other would be you arrive at that point by evolutionary convergence, and that is something about the social behavior. Maybe the orang pendek is more gregarious, like a chimp, and which doesn't rely on the loud calls. Gorillas, to a lesser extent. Chimps defend their territory more by physical interaction, physical displays, whereas the gorillas protect their harem and keep pretenders at bay with their guttural calls. And that reflects to the potential interloper the size, the strength, the age, of the potential competition that you might be facing up to, because it's hard to kind of size up your quarry in a dense jungle.
Yeah.
The orangutan, on the other hand, also likewise. I mean, the real distinction in the behavior of the orangutan versus the gorilla monopolizes the harem. The orangutan occupies real estate. The females, when solitary females come and seek out the dominant male when they are receptive, it's time to reproduce. And that can be quite a time interval of years, 4 to 7 years between births.
Yeah.
So that might explain why there's been strong selection for the very elaborate pouches in air sacs in the orangutan because of that reliance. So the opposite being the case, if the opposite were the case with the orang pendek, then there would be strong selection pressure for the reduction of, or as in humans, elimination almost of those. So that's interesting. I mean, that's the point, that we always have to kind of couch our inferences in the possible scenarios. And as I said, I think the best explanation for a diminutive bipedal hominin, I mean, we know that Homo floresiensis anyway. If Homo floresiensis and orang pendek are indeed equivalent, and that's the argument that Gregory IV is making, we know that Homo floresiensis, based on anatomy and geometric morphometric studies of the skull, bears its closest affinities to the Australopithecines. So at least right now, it's assumed that Australopithecines are most closely related to the African apes. But even that might have individuals. I mean, there was a camp, and it was represented in the academic circles by Jeff Schwartz, but there were other enthusiasts kind of that jumped on this bandwagon that Australopithecines were actually more closely related to orangutan, and that they were our closest. And this was back before we had the whole Human Genome Project and the Chimpanzee Genome Project, and had the very extensive genetics that now, for all intents and purposes, have conclusively demonstrated our closest affinity to the African apes. So there were still arguments that were being made, sometimes on the basis of very superficial or even primitive traits that really weren't good indicators of a unique relationship between humans and orangs. When I was a graduate student, this was kind of had become popularized. Jeff Schwartz, I'm sure I've still got his book right up there on my top shelf, wrote both a popular and edited an academic collection of academic papers on this topic. But so it's you have to be cautious. I guess the take-home message: you have to be cautious about drawing conclusions. This is where we're still in the hypothesis generating phase of much of this. And so that's the fun thing about this book, is it provides the opportunity to generate these alternative hypotheses and then marshal the evidence. Let those be your influence, and at least lending some order to your consideration of the evidence, and see whether they support or refute one or the other of the hypotheses. So we'll see how it comes out.
Excellent. So is that due for release later this year, sir? Oh,
no. That's the unfortunate thing. So I think, he's in the process of filming. I haven't had a good status meeting with him. It's certainly not my project. We have brainstormed extensively when we were making kind of an exhaustive list of some of the changes, some of the innovations and new thoughts and new lines of evidence in the past couple of decades. So I helped contribute with those conversations. but he has told me that he's been shooting. I've been privy to a couple of the interviews that he's had. So I don't know if he's realistically shooting for an end of this year release of the documentary. The book's going to be next summer, probably. If I can get the main bulk of it written this summer, then just the editing and the figures. I'm big on figures. There's almost 150 figures. He wants to load it up like Michael Freeman did.
Yes.
QR codes.
Ah.
And I'm all for that to an extent, but as an appendix rather than
Yes.
Because what happens when the server's gone? I don't want them to become obsolete if the server you look at those as extra, but I don't want them to. I want the figures as well as QR codes.
Yeah.
But it does provide a real interesting way to augment the experience with having all these different, audio files and images and movie clips and things that can be that can augment the content. So by the time we get all of that, I think it'll be an early summer of 2025. So it probably won't be in lockstep with the release of the documentary. So something to look forward to.
Excellent. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for spending some time speaking with me. It's been a real pleasure and an honour. So thank you for fitting me in. I already know your schedule as you re-emerge, as you say, back in and dealing with the health and taking it as steady as a man who works as hard as you do can. And so where can everybody get a hold of your previous work and follow you online and keep up to date with everything that's going on, sir?
Sure. Well, I not super versed in the digital age, so I basically rely on my Facebook page as sort of a bulletin board of announcements as well as interesting tidbits. So my Facebook page, which is under my full name, Don Jeffrey Meldrum, but I'd also point people to, I made mention of it briefly at one point, the journal that I edit, which is the Relic Hominoid Inquiry. It's an online refereed scholarly journal. We're in our 13th year, so we've gotten quite an accumulation of research. I mean, being very specialized, it's fairly narrow, but we have quite an accumulation of research articles, in-depth book reviews. So if you're wondering, the more scholarly titles, not the plethora of self-published, vanity pieces that are out there, but in-depth book reviews that really go into the meat of the book, not just how many figures, how many pages, how many typos, and so forth. Historical items, translations of foreign papers, like some of the works of Mary Jean Kaufman, for example, on the Almasti, that were never available to Anglophones really before, and so on. That is the Relic with a T, Relic, which is the appropriate usage in biological sciences, hominoid inquiry, RHI. If you just Google that, it will come up. Otherwise, it's www.isu, Idaho State University, .edu/RHI. Very easy to enter. So, and those are very accessible. We're just kind of getting going. With an emphasis in citizen science. So there will actually, whereas all the contributions you'll see are by academicians with credentials or professionals of appropriate specialty, we're also including, field reports and essays and analyses by non-academicians. They're expected to meet a certain standard, and they'll receive lots of help in editing their efforts by the editorial board and myself. But we want to not only provide a credible venue for that type of work, but also encourage individuals to raise their bar of their own investigations, and recognize that sharing data is critical, reporting data. Otherwise, it's just a personal story. Someone kicks around online. But if you have had peer review and evaluation and so forth, and it makes a meaningful contribution to the body collective of knowledge, then we're all for that.
Fabulous. Well, I'll put links to both in the show notes for everybody. And I just want to say thank you once again for spending some time out of your hectic schedule to speak with me. And I hope it's not the last time we speak, Dr. Meldrum. Thank you again.
Likewise. My pleasure. Thank you.